Welcome. This is Glenn, and you're listening to Earth Conversations. Earth Conversations is about engaging thoughtful individuals in meaningful conversations that connect their interests and insights to the vision of a thriving, beautiful planet. Earth Conversations is produced in the studios of KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado, and available 24/7 at kwsiradio.org. Today's guest is Jacob Richards. Jacob, a well-known community activist and publisher of the Revolutionist, is dedicated to preserving the memory of the progressive and radical history of the Grand Valley. Welcome, Jacob. And the first question, Jacob, is, do you still self-identify as a socialist these days? And would you give us a short intellectual history of your political identity?
I think I've become more conservative in my old age and have become a socialist. I used to really much more identify as an anarchist. And I would still like to see, power and hierarchy as diffuse and as, least pyramid shaped as possible. But I don't think like a pure anarchist system could work anymore. So ideologically, I've always grown up in a political household. My mom's been an elected official since I was a young person. Some of my earliest memories are being at National Organization of Women's meetings, playing in the back room of the library. So by the time I was 18, I had 6 years of electoral politics. I remember knocking doors and dragging old ladies to the polling booth right up until 7 o'clock before we had cell phones and stuff like that. But I've also kind of seen that that the system that we have here is kind of incapable of making some of the changes communities want. That we continue to live in a system where a golf course's right to be profitable supersedes the citizens' right to allocate water resources where a community and a society sees fit, and that right to profit I continue to see as our main obstacle to solve pretty much any of our issues in our society, from racism to gentrification to homelessness. It keeps coming down to the economic system and that right to profit.
Okay, so you sent me 4 names: Carl Gleiser, James Buckland, George Falconer, and S.B. Hutchinson. These are 4 people you regard as key individuals in the early radical history of Grand Junction. Can you say something about why you regard these 4 people as so important?
And I think you touch on something that's just interesting and kind of lesser known. But for the first 4 decades of Mesa County's history, this area really was the most progressive, if not radical, area in the entire state. And you see people like James Buckland, who was one of the Grand Junction Town Company founders. He was the lawyer for the original founding town company. You really see him being the face and a leading voice of progressive movements from the 1880s all the way into the 19-teens. And so in my historical research, I've really begun to refer to that whole era of 1880 to World War I as the Buckland era. And then the era after that would clearly be the Walter Walker era. And, they all kind of bring different elements to the story. Gleiser was in many ways kind of like the town's first radical. He was here within the first dozen or so people to settle here in the Grand Valley. He was an avowed anarchist. He was a German immigrant. And at that time, Germany, the home of Karl Marx, was in the process of deporting a whole bunch of homegrown German radicals, and a lot of them ended up here. And when they ended up here, they were, a lot of times, these immigrants were also on the very edge of the frontier. And in a lot of ways, because Western Colorado was Ute territory until 1881, Western Colorado was like one of the last frontiers to be settled in the West. And Gleaser, he left his mark, even though he was only in this area for maybe the first 10 years, the 1880s. He was an avowed anarchist. He was a labor organizer with the Knights of Labor, which was a strong union, and Grand Junction was a very strong union town at that time. But Gleaser also continued to kind of be a revolutionary even after he left town. During World War I, he was incarcerated and arrested under the Espionage and Sedition Acts and charged with, publishing anti-war, anti-draft articles. And what's interesting too about Gleaser is that he spent his later years in this socialist colony in Louisiana after being released from prison, and there he edited the newspaper. And so in the editorials, he often kind of tells stories about the founding of Grand Junction and some of these battles. So he was labor organizer. We founded our Knights of Labor in 1884, and in 1885, just after the Knights of Labor here was organized, there was a large strike on the Denver-Rio Grande line, and Grand Junction workers participated in that strike and lost really badly. U.S. Marshals came into town and arrested the leaders, took them off to Denver for trial a couple months later, and Gleaser talks about how the Knights of Labor almost didn't even survive that initial thing. But I think that looking at that Knights of Labor, that year of 1885, when also local farmers' alliances were formed in Delta and Mesa County, kind of as the beginning of the progressive era, as people kind of organized to push back. The farmers' alliances here were mostly organizing in order to negotiate cheaper freighting rates with the train companies to take their agricultural product at a cheaper rate to market. And then also in the 1880s, we really see the first kind of socialist influence. There was a short-lived party in New York City called the United Labor Party. The United Labor Party kind of centered around a writer and economist named Henry George. And Henry George wrote this book that has recently been gaining a fair bit of popularity called Progress and Poverty. And in 1886, the United Labor Party of New York ran Henry George as a third-party workers' candidate for mayor of New York City. And though it was like a third party that was mostly based in New York, other radical hotbeds like Leadville and Grand Junction, Colorado, also formed short-lived United Labor parties. And it's significant that the United Labor Party included in its kind of core founding documents a number of socialist groups as well as progressive unions. So you could really say that 1886, 1887 was the first kind of glimpse of a local socialist movement with United Labor Party. And that really kind of merges into the 1890s, where there was a short-lived populist party. This was unlike the populists of today. It was a left-wing populism, and this was in Colorado elected James Weaver, which was the third-party populist party presidential candidate that didn't win. Colorado did elect Davis H. White, populist out of Pitkin County. And this party was anti-capitalist, they're anti-monopoly, but they were very nativist. They were very much against immigration, especially immigration, Chinese immigration, and immigration from Mexico. But they did have this anti-capitalist bent, and this was a very strong populist stronghold. Mesa County went for Weaver, and Mesa County went for Governor Waite at higher percentages than the rest of the state. And we see in that era, that populist era, what I've started to call the summer of revolt in 1894. And some of that context is in 1890s, the president started a tariff war. The economy really fell off a cliff in 1893. And back then there was no social safety net at all. And literally people were starving on the streets of almost every American town and city. The Pullman strike was a really interesting thing in local history. It it amazed me when I started studying local history how many of the kind of local historians I would ask about like railroad strikes, and they're like, oh, we didn't really have any railroad strikes here. But we definitely had a couple of railroad strikes, and the 1894 one was the biggest one. The Pullman strike started over a wildcat strike out of Pullman, Illinois. It was a company town owned by George Pullman. Pullman would manufacture these luxury sleeper cars that would be attached to almost every train in America. And the American Railway Union, organized by Eugene Debs, sought to be more of an industrial union that organized people in every aspect of the railroad industry. The workers at Pullman asked the ARU to support their strike. The ARU voted, we're not going to strike, but what we'll do is we'll boycott working any train with a Pullman car. And this essentially shut down the nation's railroads. And the president, ordered federal troops and the U.S. Marshals to, with violence, to suppress the strike, to break the strike and get the trains working again. Around July 1st, a train left Denver with 600 newly deputized U.S. Marshals with the intention of heading all the way to Ogden, where the citizens had captured a couple trains and were camping in front of and in rear of the trains. And the idea was that these marshals would put down this strike in every rail junction between Denver and Ogden, Utah. And the people in Grand Junction knew this train was coming. So the Populist Party, along with the American Railway Union and others, just local citizens seeking to stand in solidarity, all met down in Whitman Park ahead of the arrival of these U.S. Marshals. And they made a plan to resist. And I'm going to quote U.S. Marshal Joseph Israel. Israel in this little communication is basically reporting back to his superiors on D.C. and kind of explaining why it took so long for them to get to Ogden. Quote, the conditions of affairs at Grand Junction were extraordinary. My deputies were met not only by strikers at that point, but by citizens who had met in public hall prior to their arrival and resolved to not only resist entry of the deputies to the town, but also to give them no quarter or sell them anything to eat. And what ended up having to happen was that the train was put into reverse. The U.S. Marshals went back to the town of Palisade, were able to get room and board and water there in Palisade. And then in the middle of the night, the Marshals re-entered Grand Junction, took the rail yards by force, and arrested a number of the strike leaders, kind of disappearing them out to Denver in the middle of the night. And on 4th of July, 1894, Grand Junction woke up to martial law. And the populists lead right into kind of the socialist movement, which really started in 1898 locally. And there would be a continuous run from 1898 to 1917 of there being a very active socialist party, including publishing a number of socialist newspapers. There was at least 7 socialist papers that were published in Grand Junction during that time period that I can find. There's likely other ones that I can't find reference to. But it really was like a robust, prolonged movement, and a lot of times the histories you do see of this town, they mention the socialist movement, but they very much kind of minimize it as this this short-lived little dalliance with socialism. But really, it was a 20-year-long movement. It was really heavily suppressed at World War I, and then you saw it kind of reemerge in the 1920s to support the farmer labor candidate. And then by 1934, a Mesa County Socialist Party had been reorganized, and they were running a full ticket of candidates, which is still something that the Democrats struggle to do today. So I think it's pretty impressive. There was even a brief period of time where the socialists were really in power here. And some people may be aware, but towns like Nukla were founded by socialists. The town Nukla was originally the Cooperative Ditch Company, and it was a utopian kind of socialist project. Everybody had equal shares. And they, for the first 20 years or so, they really tried to live by those socialistic ideals. And you can really see some of it, some of that still down there in the west end of Montrose County. The power company is a cooperative. The water and utilities and electric and telecommunications are all cooperatively owned down there. And so every user is also a voter in these collectively owned utilities. And it was an interesting era. You saw kind of socialists having their hands in the fact that we have Grand Junction is city-owned water versus a private company. There was a big debate about that for about 20 years. And you saw the populists kind of fighting that, and later the Socialist Party fighting that, and S.B. Hutchinson and Mayor Todd kind of getting it codified that it was going to be city-owned water and not owned by a private company at the whims of their profit motives. Another one, I have an interesting photo in my research showing John Otto, the father of the monument. On the first tour he took the Chamber of Commerce on, the early Chamber of Commerce was pretty heavily populated by the local Socialist Party. So they weren't just involved in socialist politics, they were involved in community politics. They were involved in fundraising money for the YMCA. They were involved in creating the Arbor I forget the name of the organization, but it was a short-lived organization that sought to plant trees all over town so there'd actually be shade here in Grand Junction. But there's this picture from 1908 that's titled on the back of it, John Otto and the Chamber of Commerce. And in the picture, you can see George Falconer, who went on to form both of the early communist parties in the 1920s, and S.B. Hutchinson there. And if you know the history of the monument at all, the Chamber of Commerce was really the first organization to be like, get on board with the Colorado National Monument. And in fact, even after the Park Service took it on, the Park Service delegated management of the National Monument to the Grand Junction Chamber of Commerce for like the first 20 years. So the fact that we have a national monument is directly tied to socialists and communists in this photo, and our local water, and just a number of kind of other progressive movements at that time.
Oh, fascinating.
Sorry, that was longer than we expected.
No, that's good. So some of these questions I'm going to ask you, you may have already answered them, but I don't think it will hurt to have you reiterate them. So do you think that the radical history of Grand Junction makes it easier to build socialism here? And do you still regard this as the goal?
Really, I think I don't think it's a super direct thing, but I do think, I don't think there's like a direct connection where we can be like, oh, because we were like this. But I do think like continuing to tell ourselves that Grand Junction is a conservative heck hole that'll never change, that's not a message we can tell ourselves over and over again and hope to change anything. So I think if we can look back through history and find some times where it wasn't so much like it is now, it proves that things are changeable. And at one time we really were, by the numbers, not really even an opinion, by electoral numbers, the most progressive county in Colorado. So I don't think there's like a direct, there's not like a cultural history or like a institutional memory of socialism, but I do think looking at and examining and studying ways people have tried to make change in the past can help influence how we're going to make change in the future.
Okay, so this is more of this is a question about more at the national level. Do you see any historical connections between the progressive era, which dates from about 1890 to 1920, and the early conservation movement associated with figures like Theodore Roosevelt and John Muir?
Yes and no. I think one of the big things to realize is that like a lot of things that we don't consider progressive now were also part of the progressive era. So like eugenics, it was not a totally debunked science back then. And it was part of this kind of progressive ideal that like, hey, with some science and some scientific rationale, we should be able to figure out anything and improve things. So you saw movements like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and eugenics all kind of falling under the rubrics of like the progressive era and progressivism. So I think, you see some people starting to question the science of game management, and that's definitely where Teddy was coming from, was from a hunting point of view. And that's when you started seeing like the first state biologists and the first state licensures and stuff like that. I think it's really important to remember we had to bring elk back to Colorado because we ate them all during that kind of lawless period between the opening of the frontier and the beginning of real land management. So, yeah, I think land management definitely kind of falls under that kind of science and progress kind of air of the progressive era.
Okay. Now, I read that you were the editor of the Earth First Journal for a period, and that you are now a wilderness guide. How does wilderness preservation and restoration fit into your activism and overall worldview?
I don't know. I don't think it's as actionable. I don't think it's a topic that really moves people to kind of the revolutionary actions I think we need to save the environment. I was co-editor of the Earth First Journal, and I am kind of on the tail end of about a 10-year career as a wilderness guide. And so, I think these roadless areas and these wilderness areas are vitally important. And I think, it's biased because I make a fair bit of my money in, designated roadless areas and designated wilderness areas. But we clearly, I don't know, it's a tough balance. I would prefer more roadless areas in general. I'm a kind of hike and horse and raft and paleo travel kind of person. I think it just kind of gets mixed up and becomes something of a lesser issue. I think with everything that's going on, like it's hard to advocate for common sense environmental policy to a government with no common sense.
Okay.
And you can't make, like, there's no logical or pathos or logos or ethos that you can throw at these people, you know what I mean, at some level. So I think that makes that kind of organizing tough, and I tend to kind of feel like where there's momentum is where I end up going as an organizer, because I generally support all these different causes, you know what I mean, but where there's momentum is where organizers need to be, so we can capture that momentum and direct it and channel it and that kind of stuff.
Okay. So what do you find in the woods and in the canyons that is so important to you?
You're hitting me at the burnout point in my career. I'm so tired of taking billionaires on fly fishing trips.
Okay.
So there's some part of me that's like, yeah, I make my money doing this, but there's this classist thing where, it's only, the well-to-do that can even begin to afford the fly fishing trips that I lead. And I would love to see more effort in getting people that are generally marginalized in our society. Those same people are very marginalized from our wilderness areas too. Not only are they marginalized in the city, you go out to the woods and you don't see a lot of minorities out there because camping gear is expensive. Fly fishing trips are expensive. Renting a crew of horses to pack all your stuff into the remote camp is expensive. So I think there's kind of a unfair disproportion of who gets to enjoy those wild spaces.
Any comments on the wolf reintroduction program?
I'm pretty neutral on it. I think healthy ecosystems have alpha predators. I think ranchers and farmers in general are the biggest bunch of babies about stuff like that. They get so much compensation from us taxpayer dollars. It's like even in this town, like, you hear these people like, oh, I'm fourth generation independent farmer. And I'm like, so are you under the Highline Canal? Because the Highline Canal would be like something, if we were to do it in today's money, something like $180 billion worth of taxpayer dollars went into making sure every farm that's irrigated off the Highline Canal can get farmed. So I think we can look back to that and be like, no, is all these things are a little more collective. and there's better range management. You look at countries like Romania that still have significant wolf populations and significant bear populations, and their farmers and herders have figured out ways to kind of coexist with these alpha predators.
Okay, so on the mountain lion initiative, Proposition 127, you know that it failed.
Mm-hmm.
Basically across the state, it was 55% against it. And within Mesa County, it was 67% against it. Why do you think it failed?
I mean, because the biologists in the state and the people that, we always want everybody else to trust science, like, oh, trust the climate scientists. Well, the range management scientists are saying our mountain lion population is healthy, and that we don't need this ban. And I was kind of against the ban of mountain lion hunting as well. And you start looking at like states like California, and I know Eric Reichel's not going to love this, but you look like at states like California. California was the first one to ban mountain lion hunting. So they went from selling 700 mountain lion tags, harvesting something like 150 mountain lions via hunters, to now a system where the state hires professional paid killers to go kill about the same amount of lions, but charging the taxpayers and the whole wildlife management system, costing them money to manage mountain lions instead of mountain lion management being something that brings them in. So the same amount of mountain lions were going to die either way, whether that law passed or not. Anytime a calf or a sheep gets killed, paid government killers are going to come chase that lion down with a pack of dogs and kill it. When you do it the other way, it's much more managed. Every single hunting unit and game management unit in Colorado has a quota. Mountain lion hunters have to call a hotline every single morning to see which units have been closed down, where the quota in this little unit has been met. And it's on the hunter to, make sure you're aware if your unit has been closed down or not. But they are pretty intensely managed. And I think it's a case where, like, if we want the Republicans to trust scientists, we need to trust the scientists as well.
Okay. I know that you see and are involved in many effective challenges to power. Social media, community building, direct action, face-to-face communication. What about electoral politics?
I think it has its limits. I don't think anything major has ever been won in an election. I don't think it really matters. I think what's much more powerful is being organized. I think back to like Nixon. Like Richard Nixon didn't want to sign the Clean Water Act. He had to because the citizens of this country were organized and demanding it. Richard Nixon didn't want to sign the Clean Air Act either, but the people of this country were organized and demanding it. Richard Nixon didn't want to end the war in Vietnam, but he did so because the Vietnamese were not going to stop resisting. Our own troops had started going AWOL and fragging their own officers, and the campuses and the streets in our American cities were also all being ungovernable. Between the Vietnamese, our troops, and the protest movement at home, there was a whole lot of ungovernability. And I think even divine right kings of old still had to lead with the consent of the governed. Because ultimately, if we choose to withdraw our support and withdraw our labor from this system, nothing will happen. And the system will just stop. You know what I mean? So I do kind of think that it's in all those things. So
I would assume you would pretty much say the same thing about lobbying of politicians and lawsuits?
Lawsuits, not so much. I think lawsuits are very much a direct way of making change. I wouldn't say necessarily direct action, but I have often said that a single individual, the two places that an individual operating as an individual can make the most amount of change is in the courts and in media. Because a single journalist can research and write a story that has changed the world. So I don't think we should ignore electoral politics. I'm not like an anarchist that's like, don't vote. I think we should vote. I think there was a saying in Mexico under the PRI ruled Mexico for something like 90 years. There was other parties, but the PRI always won. And there was a saying that said, "Oh yeah, Mexico, we're a democracy. 364 days we're not voting." And we're a democracy. The 364 days we're not voting. And I think we all have a lot more power there. I know we do, because I see small groups of people in ones and twos change laws all the time, and I've never really seen that happen through a vote.
Okay, so on this same topic of effective challenges to power, what about meditation? Because I think there's an active community here in Grand Junction. And what about wilderness outings? Are these effective ways to challenge power in your mind?
There are effective ways. I think like the wilderness outings are kind of on the educational end of things, and there's kind of this saying amongst organizers: do you educate to organize, or do you organize to educate? And it's kind of this eternal battle, So because some organizers will pick up on different things, but education has to be part of the equation, even though I don't. It's harder to make that direct connection where, raising consciousness and doing education, it's harder to make those kind of direct connections versus something like a protest movement that has a demand and gets it like a strike. We're going to strike, we're going to picket your business until you meet our demands. But I think, it's like Martin Luther King said, the power has to be demanded. You know what I mean? They're not going to give it willingly. It has to be fought for, and it has to be demanded. And that's what we saw in the progressive era. Like, these big corporations were not going to start paying people in script, and they weren't going to stop using child labor, and they weren't going to start providing 8-hour days or health insurance or social safety nets or anything like that without people kind of taking to the street and causing disruption and causing real protests,
Okay. I don't think that Eugene Debs, who is a person that we both admire, spoke much on behalf of the natural world. Or am I mistaken?
No.
It's a pity that he never met John Muir, although they were contemporaries.
Yeah, pretty interesting too, his kind of interactions with Susan B. Anthony that she wrote about in her memoir. And I mean, Eugene Debs, in a strange way, had kind of this reoccurring impact here in town, because he was, organized the ARU that led the Pullman strike in 1894. Which was ultimately crushed. Eugene Debs spent a couple years in jail over it. While he was in jail, he kind of became radicalized, and that's where he became a socialist. He came out a socialist and ran for president under the socialist ticket something like 5 times, I want to say. And he was on a regular kind of speaking tour, and he spoke here in Grand Junction in 1908 to something like 1,000 attendees. So he was kind of definitely the Bernie AOC of his era, coming into town and drawing huge crowds like that.
Okay, so here's a personal statement and a question. I think that if we are going to revive socialism in Grand Junction and in America, then we have to put it on a wilderness foundation. So I don't see how you get from working class consciousness to wilderness consciousness unless wilderness consciousness is included in the struggle from the beginning. So do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think anything other than consumer capitalism will be less impactful on the environment. I think solving a lot of these working class issues is actually the solution to the environmentalism. Like, I grew up in the Aspen area. It is super green, but it is also the least green place in the world. These towns all have open space and green space, but when 40,000 people commute from 3 counties away every single day, all that green space that could be high density worker housing makes everything in that entire valley have a much deeper carbon footprint than anywhere else. So like it's a lot of kind of environmental racism and privilege that happens. Like I was living in the Silt Rifle area during the oil and gas crisis and drilling boom. And it was really disconcerting to see kind of the wealthy Save the Thompson Divide folks willingly telling these oil and gas companies that like the lower valley is much better for drilling, but this area by Carbondale is just not worth drilling. So I think, the extreme wealth, the extreme consumption-based society we have now, and those things are all very much tied into capitalism, the manufactured obsolescence and that kind of stuff that just keeps us buying a new microwave every 3 years because it was designed to break in 3 years. I think we start solving those kind of problems. We start engineering products in a way that they last, and or if they're not going to last, are at least repairable, and if not repairable, at least downcyclable. But we basically that any sort of challenge to capitalism would have a positive environmental impact because the waste of the world is capitalism. You know what I mean? The trash in that gyre, in the Pacific trash gyre, it was all created by capitalists. Yeah. So as soon as we can stop, turning, I think Parenti said it, or no, it wasn't Parenti. Not going to remember the guy, but that's what capitalism does. It takes the green, living earth and turns it into money. At its very foundation, at the very core of the thing. Until we start to curb that and restructure that system, we have no chance of even tapping the brakes on climate change, or even all the other environmental issues too. As long as it's profitable for me to dump my waste in your river, they're going to do it. So yeah, I think fundamentally, capitalism is not good for the environment and is likely, at least under our constitutional system, is not fixable.
There's a lot of fear around socialism and wilderness. So you have any comments about moving beyond it?
It takes people it takes people taking effort to consciously kind of deprogram the propaganda that we've all been subject to for 100 years. Think about a 5-year-old. You can take any 5-year-old on this planet and you can ask them, does a hungry person deserve to eat? And every 5-year-old in the world will say yes. It takes, it takes a lifetime of state and corporate propaganda for us to unlearn that kind of basic sense of humanity. So it takes effort, and that's also why it's really hard for people, because it involves challenging a whole lot of our preconceived notions. One of the ones that always gets me on the news is they talk about China wants to take over Taiwan. And you're like, did you know that the government in Taiwan actually considers themselves the legitimate government of all of China? That's really wacky. They want to take over all of China and claim all of China as theirs. But we only hear that China wants to take over Taiwan. Right. And it's like, yeah, and Taiwan wants to take over China. Like, it's like Korea. It was a civil war that we got into, and that's where it stalemated. The nationalists, the fascists, capitalists under Chiang Kai-shek, they ended up in Taiwan. Mao won the mainland. But that's exactly what happened in North Korea as well. You know what I mean? We fought to a stalemate, and now that's where the border is. But they both, the South Korean government and the North Korean government, considers themselves the legitimate government of all of Korea. But, we don't get that double-sidedness of it. We get a very manufactured consent by Chomsky and stuff really gets into that of how we hold, certain countries to different standards. Like, but we need to start questioning that. Like, why why do we just let CNN tell us that China's a threat? Like, who has China invaded in the last 30 years? I mean, we've invaded Vietnam, we've invaded Grenada, we've invaded Panama, we've invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. We have troops in Syria. We still have troops in Iraq.
Very true.
Like, who's the scary one here? Like, China hasn't invaded anybody since that little war in the 70s with India.
So this fear is also a reason why the pro-Palestinian rallies that take place every other Saturday on the corner of 12th Street and North are not getting bigger and stronger as they should, despite the horrors happening in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. I know you are much younger than myself, but can you remember a time in America when fear was this strong?
As a historian, I'd say around World War I, we saw repressions of this level between kind of 1917 through 1919, the Red Summer of 1919. We saw thousands of Americans locked up for free speech, for speaking out against a war, for speaking out against a draft. We saw hundreds of foreign-born radicals, some with their citizenship, without due process, rounded up and shipped off to countries. Some of them they had never lived in before. This is the famous Soviet arc that took Emma Goldman back to Soviet Russia. So I think there is a living memory of that. That period also had a lot of kind of paramilitary, so kind of officially sanctioned, but not really under any sort of accountability groups, kind of like loyalty leagues and home guards and stuff, kind of running rampant and participating in violent acts of vigilantism against people that were perceived to be anti-war or anti-government or pro-German.
Mm-hmm. So some intelligent people are thinking about leaving America. What do you say to this as an option?
I think that's a privilege. I think that's something for that's a privilege for people that are wealthy, and I'm sure they'll take it. But I'm also sure that Costa Rica does not want all of us. And I mean, I think that that's also not without historical precedent. I have interviewed people that were born here and who had to leave the United States to avoid the draft during the 1960s, during the Vietnam War, that still haven't come back to the States, who still, just feel like exiles and are going to live their life as exiles. So it's not the first time that people have fled the country to avoid the federal government. And I think we, should learn from some of that stuff. I think, having bond funds like they did in the 1960s, really key. If you got busted for failing to induct into the draft, we could bond you out and you could have a running chance at making it to Canada at least, you know what I mean? And I think, getting some bond funds set up so activists and people that are taking risks fighting this administration have that backup plan. I think leaving the country without a warrant is cowardice. Okay. If you have a warrant, I'll help you go.
Well, let's get back to history. We're getting towards the end of the questions and the time. So S.B. Hutchinson stays in my mind, a socialist police chief in Grand Junction in 1911. Do you think something or someone like this could happen again in Grand Junction in the foreseeable future?
I ran for office as an avowed anarchist and almost got elected back in 2011. So I don't think it's impossible. But I think, why he won elections as a socialist, and you can see in a couple results that he really outpaced his socialist peers in elections. So he ran for sheriff in 1912 and he lost. But if you look at the results, most of the socialists got right around 1,000 votes, kind of people just voting Socialist Party ticket in 1912. He had 1,800 votes for sheriff, and he came within 100 votes of being elected sheriff as a socialist in 1912. So, but you could see that his kind of regular community-wide engagement and just being a kind of outstanding person and kind of walking the walk and leading by example led him to kind of get support from people that were not generally socialist, but were like, well, I'm not a socialist, but I like SB. So there was a lot of personal cult about that. And another thing I think they just did better back then, and this is something I've even encouraged the Democrats to do, is to go get involved in the community. Go, the socialists back then were, like I think I mentioned before, they were involved in, fundraising for the YMCA. They were involved in setting up the Chamber of Commerce. They were involved in the IWW, the International Workers of the World, and they were involved in other, you see them elsewhere. And I think it's just a different era at some level, and in terms of that, but the civic involvement back then was admirable, regardless of party and regardless of politics. The amount of money that could be raised by just calling a general meeting, electing some officers, appointing some subcommittees, and starting fundraising would be the equivalent of raising, $20 million in a week or something. If, the town leaders all called a mass meeting and we decided to do it, they could do it fast. Like I think about the YMCA, I think it was like 10 days in, they had almost $100,000 raised, which in 19-0's money is something in like the $20 million in 10 days raised. And I can't even fathom a community project, even if it was, robustly supported by all sides, taking off with that much steam nowadays. So there's just a lot more civic involvement. There's Charles Putnam wrote a book about social capital called Bowling Alone, and I think that really says a lot about where we are as a society, and that's why I very much am always pushing membership-driven organizations, because I think, I want to know who votes, why they vote, who's in the room when they vote, who's allowed in the room, who has a vote, who doesn't have a vote, how are decisions made as organizations. And I think more and more of these organizations, it's becoming harder and harder to answer that question as they become kind of, more and more hierarchical and more closed door and more less and less democratic. And you're even seeing democratic organizations becoming less democratic, and I think that's a problem.
So some say that the favorability of socialism is growing in America. Some recent polls that I've seen suggest 40% overall, 40% of Americans, and among the young, it's closer to about 50%. Is capitalism becoming an ugly word?
I think it's been an ugly system for a while. It is, and it's just not working. I think if we had the capitalism, the very state restricted capitalism of the 50s and 60s, I don't think people would be as anti-capitalist as they are now. For young people, it's just not working out. They can see that they can't earn enough to cover the necessities of life. And I've always been, relatively low income, and there is the trifecta. And most working class people in America cannot do all three. They can't have a working vehicle, keep a legitimate rent or mortgage, and have health insurance. So it's like you always got to, if you're working poor, if you're the working class, you're always trying to figure out how to fudge one of those, like limp along this beater another year, and let's not insure me for this year, but insure you and the kids, and we'll save a little bit of money, or let's keep my income low enough that I don't get kicked off Medicaid, so let's limit how much I earn so I can stay on Medicaid. Those are the games that people have to play, or they live in a camper or live somewhere rent-free. You can't do all three on a wage in America. So I think if capitalism was meeting people's basic needs, it would have a much higher favorability. But it quite frankly is not it's not meeting 40% of America's needs, and it's not meeting probably more than half of young people's needs. So I think when we had a very controlled, very Keynesian government spending kind of economic outlook, capitalism was working for people. And the capitalism of the 1960s seems like socialism almost compared to what we have now. But but that was largely because of the populist movement and the radicals, people marching tens of thousands deep under red banners in the 1930s and stuff. that's how the system always responds to radicals. It's the reform, always a mixture of reform and repression.
Mm-hmm.
And so, there was a lot of repression. There was Ludlow massacres. There was the strike breaking that happened during the Pullman strike. But also, you saw people like Teddy Roosevelt and later his cousin? FDR was his cousin. Yeah. And then later you saw his cousin FDR kind of adopt the same idea of like, hey, we have to give these people something. Or else we are going to continue to add fuel to the fire. We continue to add credibility to everything Eugene Debs says, the more we do this stuff. So let's do something else. And I think that's really kind of what this country needs is a New Deal, and people committed to a New Deal. And that's still, that's what you see on a lot of like the memes that are shared by Democrats and stuff is a whole bunch of accomplishments that were accomplished 90 years ago. And they're like, thank a Democrat. We did this 90 years ago. And it's like, yes, but you've also been part of the bipartisan 50-year-long project to disassemble it. And that's called neoliberalism. And it's, based on austerity and so you can't, the Democratic Party should not be claiming victories that they did 90 years ago. Like nobody should be claiming victories from 90 years ago. And then to be claiming those as victories while the party has been, an active participant in rolling back our social safety nets and our New Deal protections for the working class.
Very well said. So just to wrap up here, can you give us 2 or 3 of your favorite sources for news?
I really like Democracy Now!, which I usually watch on YouTube, but I know we can also listen to on Wheezy Radio.
Really?
And then I really enjoy watching kind of international news, and just having to know where each country's coming from. So I like Al Jazeera. I'll even watch Russian Today. But there's no such thing as unbiased news. I think really the best you can get is news that's very straightforward on what their biases are. And Al Jazeera is a very Sunni network, and it approaches things from a Sunni network point of view. Russia Today, they have good journalism about everywhere but Russia. Anything they say about Russia is probably BS. But their reporting on America is really good. I mean, obviously because Russia kind of wants to foment both sides of things. But they do some great investigative journalism along the way. And I really think looking at international news sources is the biggest thing that Americans get wrong about their media diet. And then I think more and more there's a lot of really good YouTubers. I think like Breakthrough News, The Real News Network. What's another one on there that I really like?
Gray Zone.
Now I want to try to figure it out. But no, I think looking at reputable alternative media, I think that's kind of the credibility gap that gives the right wing and their fake news calls of fake news credibility is because the news system has been pretty biased. And I think the average working class person, they look at like the standards of living of the families on the TV shows and the sitcoms, and then they watch the news, and I don't think working class people see their reality reflected back to them in the news. You're seeing something different reality. You're seeing the story. You're the narrative. And I think the more you can diversify and consume, partisan or partisan news, as long as it's telling you what side it's from, I think I'm pretty open with. It's better than this kind of BS proposition of objectivity, because they're not objective. CNN's not objective. They sell advertising. MSNBC is not objective. They're owned by GE. They manufacture nuclear bombs. They're not going to be anti-war ever because they half of the corporation structure comes from selling weapons. They're not. There's not like left-wing CNN and right-wing Fox. There's just kind of capitalist and super capitalist media out there, unless you go out there and search for alternatives.
Final question. who is your favorite author and who is your favorite person in history?
Ooh. Favorite author, I'm going to go for a trifecta really quick. I think if you live in Western Colorado, and I was born in Western Colorado in the mountains of Colorado, you have to read Edward Abbey. Mm-hmm. You have to read Hunter S. Thompson. Mm-hmm. And you have to read Dalton Trumbo. And I think those three all have really strong ties here to Western Colorado. They're all revolutionaries in their own rights and their own kind of brands and flavors of revolution. And I think they all say a lot of things that are quite applicable today. And I don't play favorites in history. I really, in terms of favorite people in history, I really think we need to approach an awards as all thing, and I think it's really problematic when we put anybody on a pedestal. As soon as you put anybody on a pedestal, that inclination to kind of cover stuff up happens. And Buckland's a great example of that. I really like Buckland, but there was, he was kind of a big proponent for the founding of the Indian school, the Teller Indian School here. And had his fingerprints in that stuff. And it would be dishonest to just give him a pass on that, as much as, it would be dishonest to totally condemn him to the dustbin of history for that too, because the Indian schools kind of was the progressive option on the Indian question, air quotes. Kind of the conservatives was a full-on kill 'em all. You know what I mean? That was the conservative point of view about Native Americans in the 1880s. And the progressive point of view was, hey, we can educate them to become white people. And nowadays we look back at it and we're like, both of those points of view are awful. But I think you have to look at the warts and all. I don't have anything negative to say about S.B. Hutchinson, but if I found it, I wouldn't shy away from it in my writing or my research or talking about them either. So, there's heroes, there's people you can learn from, and then I think it's also good to just realize that nobody is perfect enough to really put on a pedestal, that all leaders and all people in history are human and have negative aspects of their being as well. So don't put me on a pedestal, and I won't put anybody else on a pedestal.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
You've been listening to Earth Conversations with Jacob Richards on KWSI 100.3 radio in Grand Junction, Colorado. Earth Conversations may be streamed anytime at kwsiradio.org. Views expressed in this program do not necessarily reflect the views of KWSI or the nonprofit that operates KWSI. For an opportunity to share your ideas on Earth Conversations, email us at earthconversations@kwsiradio.org. I'm Glenn. Thanks for listening.